Hello and welcome to the In the Tank podcast, episode 221, the podcast that explores work of think tanks across the country. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal, and joining me via phone, we've got Justin Haskins, editorial director at the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing very well, Donald. I'm doing very well. How are you?
Oh, fantastic. As always. Also joining us, back from Madrid, all caffeinated up, we have Jim Lakely, Director of Communications here at the Heartland Institute. How are you, sir?
I'm doing just great. Caffeinated and slightly irritated.
That's a great combination. We got a good episode for you today. The second half of the episode is going to be an interview that I have conducted with Bob Murphy, who is an economist and a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. We're going to be talking about modern monetary theory and Japan and their floundering economy a little bit. So we'll get to that later. I don't want to miss that one. And I think we're just going to talk about some Madrid stuff, some COP25, some climate change chit-chat to fill out the rest of this episode. Jim, you did miss out on the conversation last week about Baby Yoda, so sorry about that, man.
I did. Can we run that back?
No, we cannot. We cannot.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, we did not get the million hits that I projected by putting that in the title, so obviously that's not our target audience. I will say that I have tickets to see Star Wars Episode 9 for a week from yesterday. So I'll be seeing it on Thursday. And that means that I will come in next week on Friday, having seen it, and I can give you my non-spoiler review. So,
awesome.
Yeah, I'm sure our audience is stoked to hear that one.
Do you have a countdown clock on your nightstand so every morning when you wake up, you know exactly how long it'll be until you get to see the latest Star Wars movie?
He actually does have a countdown clock.
Yeah, I'm showing it to Jim right now. I've got it on my phone.
It's on his phone.
Which is my alarm
he
clock.
legitimately has a countdown clock.
It is my alarm clock. So yes, that is absolutely the truth.
I can't even parody that. It's real.
It's beyond parody. Whatever, man. Whatever. I'm stoked. I am so excited, and I'll give you my full-on review, no holds barred. Well, I won't spoil anything, but I'll give you my non-spoiler review.
There needs to be holds barred. So.
Yes, that's true, but I won't pull any punches. Let's say that. All right. Well, I don't know. What do you want to jump into COP25, Jim? We were wondering if you were going to come on last week, but I figured flying back from Spain, you might have been a little tired, so we let you off the hook.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, so you recovered.
We were actually wondering if you were going to come back.
Yeah. No,
Period.
I'm
were
back.
you ever coming back, or were you going to be killed by the protesters over there? We didn't know, honestly. We weren't sure. So
yeah,
you survived.
Give us a run through of just kind of your experience there. I mean, did you get in any fisticuffs, any rough situations? What happened?
No, there weren't any fisticuffs or rough situations. We were set up in a beautiful hotel near the airport and actually near the COP location, which of course the United Nations had to scramble to put together because of the canceled COP originally as planned in Chile, Santiago, Chile, because of riots in the streets over radical environmental policy. So, as far as I knew, there were no riots in the streets of Madrid. And the Heartland Institute was there, as we've been to several of the what they call the Conference of the Parties, the big United Nations, the annual United Nations Climate Confab. And we're there to put on a program that shows that what the United Nations has planned for the world to ruin our economies and control our lives is not necessary scientifically.
Sure.
And so we've done this in Paris. We did it in Katowice, Poland, last 2 years ago. And we did it again this year in Madrid. And we put on a program. We have 14 videos actually on a playlist at Heartland's YouTube page. It's called Heartland Tube on YouTube. Those videos of those presentations have now collected more than 300,000 views in less than 2 weeks, or in 2 weeks, and that's quite amazing. And I think it really shows that people are hungry for the truth when it comes to what's going on in the climate. We also had our most popular video actually is from a young woman, 19-year-old named Naomi Seipt, and she is kind of being marketed as the anti-Greta.
Right.
She's not there wagging her finger in your face and telling you the way you need to live your lives.
How dare you, Jim?
How dare you? No, she's not there. Actually, if Naomi's there to say how dare you, it's how dare you steal my future.
Sure.
It's completely the opposite of Greta. She's a remarkable young woman. She has extreme skepticism of government controls in Germany and elsewhere around the world. She has a very good following on her own YouTube page. So she's a bit of a YouTube star in her native Germany. That video alone has 75,000 views on it in just a couple of weeks. We don't spend any money on marketing, so these people are finding this on their own on YouTube. And it's really satisfying to go to Madrid and to be really the only organization in the world that is going to present a counter conference of sorts, to present the science and policy expertise that shows that, one, the science doesn't justify the United Nations controlling the energy economies of the world, that we don't have to go all quote unquote green, and that we can't actually go all green. One of our presenters was Wolfgang Mueller from EICE in Germany. He has been specializing in presentations on how the attempts by Germany to go with all wind power has been an enormous disaster for the country. And so, without us there, without the Heartland Institute in Madrid, nobody would be presenting these ideas. Nobody would be actually telling the truth there. And it's in quite a contrast to all the hullabaloo made about Greta going there and lecturing the world again that you're not doing enough. I'm not happy. The children of the world are not happy. You're not fixing things fast enough for us. I mean, as if it could be fixed or needs to be fixed. It's ridiculous. I know that Harrison Ford was there and he lectured everybody. Yeah, I don't think he came over on a catamaran sailboat either. He may have come on a private jet. I'm just guessing.
Right.
So it was really, really important that Harrison Ford get up there on the main stage and tell everybody that we need to act now. I mean, it's all just so silly. And, I'm really proud that the Heartland Institute is there because it's not silly, that these are serious plans by global powers that want to change the way we live our lives, and it's not scientifically necessary. And all the while, letting China and India, the two biggest polluters, real pollution, and emitters of carbon dioxide on the planet. And so the whole thing is a scam, especially when you consider those two things. And I would have some respect for Greta Thunberg if she would stop wagging her finger in the face of the United States, which has reduced our CO2 emissions more than any industrialized nation in the world since Paris, which we got out of, and instead went over to China and wagged her finger at them. Let's see how that goes over. Or go over to the people of India, which are probably not going to imprison her for speaking out of line, but would actually say back to her, you know what? Here in India, we've had crushing poverty for almost the entire 20th century, and for most of our lives, and we are now emerging from it by the use of fossil fuels. And we are not going to stop enriching the lives of the billion people that live in India because you're wagging your finger in our face.
Yeah, I mean, that can't be said enough. The idea that the United States makes up like 15% of CO2 emissions. China alone is double that. It's like 30%. And like you said, the United States has trended down in CO2 emissions over the past like 15 years, thanks mostly to fracking and natural gas. Whereas China has no signs of slowing down. So it's like, get your priorities straight a little bit. But
if you're serious about this stuff, that's what you need to do, which means they're not serious.
Well, so I want to point to a couple of articles that I've got in front of us talking about this COP25. This first one from Reason.com, which is titled COP25 UN Climate Negotiations in Madrid Follow Traditional Dramatic Arc. So it starts off saying, open with transformational hope, sink into despair, and conclude at the last minute with a sly diplomatic equivocation and obfuscation. That's the dramatic arc of negotiations and associated activist street performances that traditionally takes place during the annual 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks long?
Yeah, it's 2 weeks. Heartland always goes the first week, so we can get all the attention.
Annual 2 weeks of the United Nations Climate Change Conferences. The 25th Conference of the Parties, COP25, of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting now in Madrid is scrupulously adhering to that script. Currently, dark despair reigns. So yeah, I could see how this to be the case. Like we go in there with all this rhetoric. It just is mired in bureaucracy and, just talk, basically. No actions actually take place. People get sad and then they're just planning on the next year's.
Right.
Like that's how it ends, figuring out where we're going next year.
Yeah, the best thing that happens at these COPs is that nothing happens at these COPs.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
Even Paris, you know, it was lauded as this great agreement. Finally, the world is on board with doing something to stop man-caused climate change. And then what happens? The next 3 COPs, all they do is complain about how nothing has happened since they signed Paris. And so, you know, that's what's wonderful about the United Nations is that they are so often so ineffective.
Yeah, I mean, I think their biggest achievement is that they figured out where they're going on vacation. I mean, where they're going to hold their next conference next year. So that's going to be in Glasgow, Scotland. You going to go?
We plan to, yes.
All right, nice. But so I was just reading that, and I was thinking, like, that definitely seems to be the case. They don't ever seem to get anything done. And I was thinking, like, if you really are somebody that thinks the world is coming to an end, you know, potentially starting within the next 10 years or so, and, like, the people that you're relying on to prevent this apocalypse is Justin Trudeau and, like, Macron from France, like, no wonder you're depressed, right?
Yeah. I mean, the climate realism movement is blessed by their opponents, and actually, freedom lovers around the world right now are blessed by the people in charge of trying to take control of of the world's economies, because they're just not up to the task. I mean, you really have to be a pretty tyrannical person to really get anything done in the United Nations, and thank goodness that's not happening.
I mean, Justin, we've heard like the same headlines, and you know, this idea of like this existential anxiety that's plaguing the youth because of this overhang of the threat of climate change, and it's like, I mean, I guess if they really do believe that, and again, their biggest saviors is Justin Trudeau, like, wouldn't you be depressed too?
Yeah, if Justin Trudeau is your savior, then it's time to just kill yourself and get it over with, because there's no hope for you. There's no hope for the planet. I'm sorry. What I really don't understand, and maybe I'm just too logical for this crowd or whatever, but at some point, don't you just lose faith in all of these people, regardless of what you believe about climate change? Don't you at some point just lose faith that these people are actually going to, you know, reduce global CO2 emissions? And then the next logical step in that is say, okay, a climate crisis is happening. If you believe that climate crisis is happening, so we're just going to have to deal with the effects of the climate crisis, and then stop on this ridiculous attempt to try to eliminate all fossil fuel emissions. I mean, fossil fuels and CO2 emissions and all of that. I mean, isn't that the next logical step in all of this? I mean, it seems like they never get to that. It's like they're in the denial stage of grief, and they just can't pull themselves out of it. Right. And they're just in it year after year after year after year after year. And they're just, we can solve this problem. We can do it. Grandma isn't really dead. I'm going to be okay. But no, Grandma's dead. If you actually think that this is happening, if you actually believe that the world is on this collision course for destruction, then I hate to break it to you, but there's no stopping it. Like, it's over. We've reached all the deadlines, all the, you know, the red line markers where supposedly once we get beyond this particular point in time, it's over. We've reached almost all of them at this point. We're rapidly approaching the next one, which is what, like 10 years from now or whatever. And nothing has happened. And not only has nothing happened, CO2 emissions have continued to increase.
Yep.
Year after year after year. And in places like China, they are planning on increasing CO2 emissions even more. And in places like India, the potential for CO2 increases is even higher. So if you believe the basic premise of all of this, that CO2 emissions from human beings is going to create a climate catastrophe, it's time to just accept that reality, if that's what you believe, and then figure out some way to deal with that.
Right.
Which, by the way, is a much more realistic approach if you're going to buy the basic premise. Just deal with whatever the consequences are, instead of spending trillions and trillions of dollars trying to prevent those things from happening, when there's just absolutely no way to do it if you really believe that human CO2 emissions are causing the problem in the first place.
That is an excellent point, and I think that like Tom Harris, who we've worked with a lot in the past, has said that very same point. Invest in adaptation rather than trying to like fruitlessly prevent anything from happening. But what you're saying actually ties really well into this other article that I've got, this one from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, titled UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Al Gore Talks, Donald Trump Vindicated. And they kind of talk about this idea of like, this growing apathy on the side of the alarmists. And so it says the UN environmental program describes the last 10 years as a lost decade with essentially no change in the trend of global emissions. And this, again, is despite the U.S. Emissions trending downward over the past 15 years. There was a report from the UN Environment Program that showed that the gap is growing, this idea that we needed to reduce our CO2 emissions by 55% by 2030, and that basically that drastic cuts in emissions require new values, new norms, and new lifestyles, all of this implying a huge transformation of the whole of humanity. And it says, in other words, it's not going to happen. Exactly. So, asked what probability they described to meeting the 1.5 degree target, one of the emissions gap's authors replied that he preferred not to pose the question because if answered, people would conclude that it's impossible and just give up. So I'm kind of wondering if there is already a group of people on the climate alarmist side that have already been kind of falling into this apathy. Like, is that the new villain for these people? They have to they're going to have to start to rebrand their proposals here and make it seem less impossible to accomplish, because that's what it seems like to me. And I'll let you respond, Jim, but I got one more quote here. This is from Yivo de Boer, who is a former secretary of the UN Climate Convention, who was a little bit more candid in a recent interview. He said the only way that the 2015 agreement can achieve a 2-degree goal is to shut down the whole global economy.
Right.
Like, that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. And first of all, the 1.5 degrees, the goal is to reduce the global warming by 2021 by 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
But that number was pulled out of the air. At first, they wanted first they wanted 2 degrees Celsius, and people were like, "Oh, that's impossible. So let's compromise, and we'll make it 1.5 degrees." So it was a completely arbitrary number, but it is impossible, and all of this is just a bunch of hooey. It might get you awarded Times Person of the Year like Greta, but it's really all meaningless. And actually, what you have to do is not really listen so much to what they say, although it's important to do so because it is a window into their totalitarian desires, as you said, control every aspect of our lives. Mm-hmm. But instead, watch what they do. Now, I mentioned that Harrison Ford, I imagine, did not sail over there on a catamaran, that he flew on a jet, and it was probably a private jet, as all these people do. I mean, if they really cared about CO2 emissions, they would actually have much smaller summits like this.
Sure.
Only bring in the principles. So this is giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Remote everybody in. Yeah, come on.
Remote a lot of people in.
What year are we in?
Yes, bring only the treaty, the quote unquote treaty negotiators in for real, and have everybody else do remotely. But they don't do that. There are tens of thousands of people that come to these things every year. So if they were serious about this, they would start with their own house, and they don't do that. But the second thing is also to look at what the markets do. Just this week, as a matter of fact, Saudi Arabia's national oil company, Aramco, had its first IPO on Wednesday. And, by how that IPO went, it indicated that the world, the market, thinks that Saudi Arabia's national oil company is worth $2 trillion. That is now topped. It was only, a year ago that Apple became the first company valued at $1 trillion. It was like $1.2 trillion. Mm-hmm. This is almost double. And all this company does is drill for oil and sell it. That's their business.
Sure.
And so the markets, I would think, are pretty confident that fossil fuels, especially oil, are going to be a very big part of our economy and the global economy for many, many, many years to come. So no matter what you hear from the United Nations, it's the markets, it's people, and even the hypocrites that go to these COPs that tell you what's really going on. And what's going on is a fossil-fueled future, and that's a good thing for everybody.
Well, the only other thing that I really want to touch on in this conversation before we throw it to myself interviewing Bob Murphy is this idea of the Extinction Rebellion, which is like the activist group that's kind of disrupting things here or there. I think they made a presence at COP25. They mentioned it in one of these articles, and everything that we talk about will be linked in the show notes if you want to read this at length. But it's just this idea that they think that the end of the world is coming, right? So it's like anything is on the table to stop that from happening. And, like, I am somewhat sympathetic in their cause. And just the idea of just like, they've been told since they were a child that the world is coming to an end. So, like, why wouldn't you do everything possible? And, like, I also am a little bit afraid of some type of societal upheaval, although I think that would be caused by government action trying to fight climate change, not climate change itself. So, yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of goes back to, like, I almost want to do a poll. All right? Like, if you were to ask people what they think the future would look like in 50 years or 100 years, I want to see what percentage or like how the demographics break up of people that have like an optimistic view of the future. We're going to have space colonies. We're going to have space stations. We're going to have flying cars. We're going to have shoes that tie themselves. Or the other side where people envision this like bleak future where we're all like mass starvation, Hunger Games, Escape from New York style stuff. And, I'm just like, I guess I'm just sympathetic to this youth that's been brought up with nothing but this idea that we're going to be heading into some dystopian future. But I don't know. What do you think on that? Justin, you want to weigh in on that idea? Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah, I think that historically speaking, the left has this very negative view of humanity. And we've seen this not just on the issue of climate, environment issues, but just on basically everything. I mean, it's sort of an environment issue, but we've talked about this before, the sort of food shortage crisis that was supposedly going to happen, and we heard about that a lot in the 1970s, and people just convinced this was what the science told them. There was just no way that humans were going to be able to survive by the time you get to the year 2000 or 2010, but because there are just too many people. There would just be so many people, and there would not be enough food production, and they were all convinced. And that's a pretty easy thing to predict, you would think, food production and population growth. And yet they got that one totally and completely wrong. And it's that plus the global cooling crisis, plus the various pollution things, the ozone layer, Y2K. There's like a million things that they say is going to happen. It's always people on the left saying that these things are going to happen. They have no faith in humanity to deal with problems that come down the road. And then they're not even good at predicting what those problems will be.
Right.
But they have no faith that humans are going to deal with them. And that's the difference, I think, fundamentally between people like myself and the many of the people on the left. I believe that humans are going to be just fine. We will figure out a way to deal with it. And whatever problems come our way, we'll figure it out. We've dealt with a lot more extreme issues than climate change or any of the things, frankly, that we've been dealing with over the past 50 years. The past 50 years have been a cakewalk compared to, the tens of thousands of years before that.
Right.
I'm really not worried about it at all. And I think fundamentally that's the difference. Mm-hmm. They don't have any hope in humanity. And most people on the right, I think just because of their nature, they tend to be a little more individualistic. They tend to believe that we don't need all of this central planning. And as a result of that, I think they have more faith in individuals, more faith in humanity to make the right decisions. And I think that's really fundamentally the difference between these two groups of people.
Jim, I think Justin stole the words right out of your mouth. Anything you want to add to that before I throw it to myself and Bob Murphy?
No, Justin is absolutely 100% correct because I said also almost exactly words to you earlier this morning over in the kitchenette. So you had mentioned how there's Extinction Rebellion. Okay, they're protesting and they'll do things. If you look around the world right now, the only place where there are massive, spontaneous protests of the people, it's in places that have tried to implement the very policies that the United Nations is trying to make the world do.
Yeah.
France, of course.
It's been going on for like a year.
Yeah,
Yellow vest.
The yellow vest, and then Chile. Why they couldn't have the COP in Chile as planned? It was because of artificially imposed by fiat policies that made energy prices so expensive that people took to the streets. And so the irony here is that you have these leftists taking to the streets to demand policies that would actually make the real people, the other, not professional protesters, but the real people, the salt of the earth type people, to actually get out of their lives, because most people just want to be left alone, and to take to the streets for real demonstrations. And so I find that kind of ironic. And it is, as Justin said, if you're on the right, you tend to be a lot more optimistic about the future because you have faith in the human condition. You actually have faith that humans can figure things out. If you're on the left, you tend to be very pessimistic. And when it comes to the climate, you are absolutely out of your mind with alarmism and panic. And it's not justified. I mean, it's justified if you like acquiring power towards central governments, which is why the United Nations and the left perpetuate it, because it keeps their people in line and keeps them voting for them and keeps them supporting them. But most of the people in their own lives are conservative. Even the liberals, like Harrison Ford, he's a liberal, he's a leftist. He says he believes in all this climate stuff, but he's not actually willing to make a difference to change his lifestyle. Neither is Al Gore, who has several homes and very large homes and has an enormous carbon footprint. Bernie Sanders has 3 homes? I mean, that are very large, and most people don't have that. And so we just live our lives, and these environmental leftists also live their lives just the way they want to, but they want to make everybody else change their lives. And what happens with that is actual revolutions on the street, actual protests on the street by the regular people of the world. And so, I hope the environmental left in the United Nations know that what fire they're playing with, because they should be warned by now just by looking at France and Chile.
All right. Fantastic. Well, let me throw it to myself and Bob Murphy. So joining us today, we have Bob Murphy. He is an Austrian economist. He is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He is host of the Bob Murphy Show. He also composes half of the Contra Krugman podcast with Tom Woods. I know that you've worked with us in the past, and I think you spoke at one of our ICC conferences. You helped us out on some Climate Change Reconsidered 2 stuff. And I think that you are going to be playing Batman on the new Batman adaptation. Can you confirm or deny that?
They really don't want us talking about that sort of thing. So,
all right. Really. We'll keep that one under wraps. But is there anything else we can add to your description here? Is something I left out?
I guess I wrote Choice. That's like a modern distillation of what Mises did in his book Human Action. So for people who want to know more about the Austrian school, I'd point them to that one. All
right, fantastic. Yeah, I must say that going back to at least 2010, I have watched videos of you, lectures that you did for the Mises University on Mises TV. So when I learned about modern monetary theory, my first instinct was to go to Mises.org and see what kind of rebuttal was up there. And I immediately found your article that was The Upside Down World of Modern Monetary Theory. I've also listened to your podcast with Warren Mosler back in February, and kind of your conversation that you had and your dissection of that in a later podcast. So I wanted to have you come on for Modern Monetary Theory, and I just want to thank you for coming on with us.
Well, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I think the best way, and I will mention to our fans listening here, if you are a constant listener, you'll know Modern Monetary Theory. I tend to bring that up a lot. But we also have Andy over here, producer extraordinaire.
Hey, folks.
Who will serve as the layman, who, if we get too far into the weeds, he's there to bring us back out of that. So
that's the role.
I think a good start for this conversation would be for you to just give us a brief kind of elevator pitch of what we're talking about when we're talking about modern monetary theory.
Well, sure. So as you mentioned, Warren Mosler is often credited as one of the sort of founders of this. And so it's sort of a modern doctrine. Of course, that's where the name comes from, modern monetary theory. But a lot of people, once it existed and was being called that, have traced it back to earlier positions like from Abba Lerner and people like that. But in any event, I think why they call it modern monetary theory is they're saying when it comes to government spending, at least for governments that are no longer constrained by the gold standard, they're issuing purely what's called fiat money, that talking in terms of budgets and, Medicare for all, how are we going to pay for that? They think that that's antique language and it's obsolete, that you're thinking like a household or a corporation. And so maybe back when governments were on the gold standard, that sort of talk made sense. But they're saying now in the modern era, that doesn't make sense anymore. And ultimately, what constrains government spending, they're saying, is ultimately price inflation. That's really the only check that the government it's not going to run out of dollars. Like the U.S. government's not going to run out of dollar bills. They can just create more. There's no hard constraint on that. The only thing that would give you pause is if they print too much money and under certain conditions, then prices might rise unacceptably fast, and that's really the constraint. So they really, I think, in terms of what they're bringing to the table right now, people like Stephanie Carlton, for example, are just rolling their eyes anytime somebody says, "How are we going to pay for this?" when they were referring to government programs.
Right. Yeah, and maybe the over boiled down, you can tell me if I'm boiling down too much, but it's the idea that because the United States has a monopoly over the production of our currency, the US dollar, that we are not necessarily constrained by the idea that we can default, because we can always just print more money. And it's the idea that debt and deficits don't matter. Is that boiling it down too much? Because I've heard some people on the modern monetary theorist side suggest that that's a caricature of their real kind of theory here.
Right. So I think that's entirely fair to say. So what they mean, like the people who bristle at that and say, "Oh, come on, you're putting words in our mouth," is I think the more nuanced statement from somebody like Stephanie Carlton or whatever is to say, deficits can matter, but not for the reason that Republican budget hawks or, Rush Limbaugh or somebody would have you believe. It's not that, oh no, we might find ourselves in a position where we're not going to be able to pay our debtors, that we've run up the debt too big and now we're going to have to default or whatever, and we're going to get a bad credit score. They're going to say, no, that's not the issue, because as you say, the Fed can just create more dollars, or, if Congress takes the power back directly, they can just print more dollars. That's not an issue. The issue is, if you borrow too much and spend too much ultimately, and then have to run the printing press to pay for it, that might cause prices to rise. So it might be that inflation, as the public generally understands that term, gets to be too high. But that would be the issue. So they would say it's not that we can spend whatever we want and there's no constraint or drawback whatsoever. They would just say it's not going to actually pinch in the area where the common rhetoric of the public discourse leads us to believe. It's not a matter of, what's our debt to income ratio, or, that who cares about that stuff. The real issue is, what's price inflation look like? And if we print more money right now, is that going to, cause price inflation to take off?
Mm-hmm. So then the stated goal of the people that are proposing or advocating for modern monetary theory is this idea that we should print as much money as necessary. The government should spend, I guess, as much money as necessary for the end goal of achieving zero unemployment, right?
Well, I mean, I think they say full employment. I don't know. To be honest, I don't know if they've ever gotten into the nuances of, what's called the natural rate of unemployment. So, I mean, just as a brief tangent here, most economists, if you said, hey, what's the optimal unemployment rate, they wouldn't say 0%, because they would say at any moment, there's churn and some businesses fail, because that's, to give everyone the freedom to open up a new business, which you want to encourage innovation and whatever, people on the ground with their own unique knowledge, you want them to try to seize opportunities as they see it. Some of them are going to be wrong, and then they have to lay off their workers when they realize their mistake. So at any given moment, you're going to have some people who are unemployed. So I think for sure you're right. What the MMT goal is to have full employment. Mm-hmm. And somebody like Mosler, I know, wants the government to have an employment guarantee. So there's always like a backstop there where anybody who wants can get a job from the government, again, paid for by printing money ultimately.
Right. So reaching full employment and the idea that the government would just spend as much money as necessary to reach that goal, I think would have a lot of people kind of on our side of the aisle get a little weary of just that. And we can get to that in a little bit. But I wanted to kind of get first to the proposed solutions if the problem of inflation did arise. So this is kind of like where I get a little bit more nervous with this conversation. So the basic idea, and again, you hear kind of the advocates for modern monetary theory say that this is a caricature of what their actual solutions are. But the basic idea is that if we're pumping so much money into the economy, we reach full employment. And then if we start to experience inflation, then they can do things to help kind of sap the economy and slow it down. One of those things is raising taxes. So it's not raising taxes to generate revenue. It's raising taxes to curb inflation. Is that kind of an accurate depiction of what their stance is?
Right. And so here, again, let's just bend over backwards to be fair. So I know exactly what you're talking about, that there are plenty of MMT canonical works in that genre, if you will. For example, Warren Mosler has, his myths or innocent lies. I forget the exact phrase, but he's got some very provocatively titled thing about false statements that people believe. And one of the standard claims in the literature in this genre is to say the purpose of taxation is not to raise revenue for the government. And at first that seems, counterintuitive, but the MMT point on this is to say you're still thinking in terms of like a household or a corporation. Remember, there's no constraint on money from a modern government's point of view, because they just print more money. And so why are there taxes at all? Then you might say, let's just get rid of taxes. And they say the reason is, as you say, that's how they sop up some of that excess demand. So if there were no taxes and everyone just knew the government's going to keep printing money in order to buy what it wants, that might lead to a collapse of the currency. And so the way to suck up those excess dollars, I'm here speaking loosely, is taxation. So again, the idea is the government can either pump money into the economy by spending it into existence and ultimately running the printing press, and it can suck money out through taxes. And so that's the MMT approach or worldview. And so it's a natural thing to believe that, so they're saying if inflation gets too high, then they would just tax it away. And I have seen isolated passages where it really does look like an MMT guru literally says that in so many words.
Right.
However, when some conservative and libertarian people started freaking out about when MMT was gaining popularity and were pointing that out, a lot of the MMT guards said, "Oh, come on, you're putting words in our mouth." No, there's lots of things we could do if price inflation started getting out of hand. It's not that we would just raise taxes. And so, for example, they might say we wouldn't spend so much, just to one thing, or if getting people to go back to work, they could produce more goods and services, and so that would there'd be more goods that the given stock of dollars would be chasing. So, I guess what I'm saying is, even though it's for sure in their edifice to say the function of taxation is to reduce the price pressure, to pull dollars out of circulation. MMT people say that's not the same thing as saying in reality, if we started spending a bunch and prices were rising, we would fix that by raising taxes.
Right.
So that's what they have said.
Right, and I'll get to Stephanie Kelton's. She's got a little bit more of a nuanced solution, quote unquote, to this idea of inflation kind of rears its ugly head. But just on that point of we could just reduce the amount of government spending. I would say when was the last time you saw the government do that?
Too. So there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program.
Right,
Exactly.
And especially in the context of things like Medicare for all. It's kind of hard to give it to everybody and then take it away. You know what I'm saying? So with the stuff they want to pay for, with these new insights offered by MMT, that to just get rid of it would be more politically difficult than just a generic spending program.
When I have been doing research on this, and I've probably mentioned this on the show, so bear with me, constant listeners, but there are some quotes, and I believe I could be misattributing this. I'm sorry if I am, but like L. Randall Wray, who talked about, who's a big proponent of modern monetary theory, and it's basically the idea that we don't need the rich people's money, we don't need tax revenue to finance any type of government spending. And it was asked what they would do with that tax money, because he's in support of taxing rich people just to kind of fix income inequality. And it's we would just burn your money. And so this is some of these modern monetary theorists, I know a lot of them have different kind of flavors of the plan that they're proposing or whatever, but some of these people are a little bit more out there than others.
Yeah, and you're right. I'm just even now looking, there's in L. Randall Wray, a blog post from May 15th, 2014, saying that one of the functions of taxation is to reduce aggregate demand. Right. So again, he's not saying there, what if we did Medicare for all and then it got out of hand? So he's not talking about what's going to happen 3 years from now if we do MMT. Mm-hmm. But that's not a straw man that the critics are inventing. Clearly, the MMT worldview says that one of the functions of taxation is to sop up aggregate demand.
Right. And just to mention, we've referenced Stephanie Kelton a few times here, and she's not just some blog poster or anything like that. She was the senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign. In fact, I think she might be the senior economic advisor to his campaign this time around, too. Not 100% sure on that. She was also the chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee for the Democrats. So it's not like she's just, she's got StephanieKelton.org that she's putting blogs up on. Like, she's a pretty heavy hitter when it comes to some of this stuff.
And for sure, she's also popularizing MMT in policy circles and, and among the intelligentsia. So
absolutely.
So right, yeah, it's if we're going to be taking MMT, at face value, yeah, her, Mosler, and Ray are like some of the three heaviest hitters in this kind of area.
Yeah. So then she says during one of a CNBC interview that she had done, she said that this idea that we could just that idea of just we'll raise taxes if we need to sop up inflation. How she says that that's kind of like a caricature, and she said that we can determine what's driving inflation. We can figure out the source of inflationary pressure and determine whether it's coming from the energy sector or it's coming from the healthcare sector, maybe the housing market, and then we can create a policy tool to help address this sector of the economy. So that was similar. That's kind of like an argument that I reference as being a little more nuanced. And I think that one actually scares me more than the raising of taxes. And because this is the idea that basically giving the government full power to alter whatever part of the economy it deems necessary to curb inflation. Basically, I would fear that they would just scapegoat whatever that they want. Let's say they blame energy for driving inflation, and then they craft a policy tool that gives the government complete control over that sector. Is that am I too far out there, or is this like a realistic concern I should have?
Oh, I think your alarm is entirely justified. And yeah, I mean, you saw that happen in the 70s, right? There are a lot of institutional factors and OPEC and stuff like that. But, why was it that prices rose so rapidly in the 70s? I think a huge part of it was that, Nixon formally closed the gold window. And that really, took the constraints off of the Fed to be able to inflate. And then, instead of just, I guess ultimately, with recent passage of Paul Volcker, people are reminiscing about that stuff. And so I think people eventually did understand what was going on and take steps to really solve the root cause of the problem. But yeah, they spent the whole decade of the 70s doing outright price controls on oil and natural gas, trying to fight the symptoms of the problem that ultimately they were responsible for. And so you're right. Because also too, you could easily imagine, let's say just to stipulate for the sake of argument, that it really is ultimately because the Fed's printing more money and that's why prices are rising. You would see it hit commodities before you would see it hit, the price of getting a haircut or something.
Sure.
And so different prices respond, with different lags in terms of a change in monetary policy. And so you could easily see somebody just looking at, crude oil prices and saying, oh, well, no, see, that's rising more rapidly than general CPI. And so clearly, it must not be the Fed's problem, must be something screwy with the energy sector. And let's go ahead and, crack down on speculation or let's go look at the margins here and refining. And you're right. They would justify all sorts of crazy anti-business regulations that ultimately are going to hurt consumers.
Right. And the idea that they would be able to, let's say inflation is coming from one of these industries. The idea that Congress is going to sit down and craft some type of legislation to deal with this is, I think, insane to think. In reality, it would just be kind of left up to the bureaucrats that are, filling these offices at these different departments that would just basically unilaterally take action. And that kind of brings me to my next concern regarding modern monetary theory, is that I think that it's the idea that it's the path of least resistance for the government. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the government doesn't have to pass a bill to enact modern monetary theory. All they really have to do is kind of convince the public that they not have to worry about the massive increases in deficit spending. In fact, I think that you could probably argue that we're doing modern monetary theory to an extent right now. Is that outlandish?
I don't think it's outlandish, and it's funny because a lot of I've debated, Warren Mosler. We had a public debates on YouTube. I'm not referring to my podcast interview with him. I'm saying several years earlier than that we had a debate, and the MMT people they think they caught me, because there's one sense in which it's like, yeah, what the MMT people say in terms of how things operate, it's not that it's wrong. It's just they make it sound like it's not a big deal and there's nothing dangerous about it. Right. So if the question is, hey, couldn't the government just print a bunch of money and pay off all the outstanding owners of treasury securities? And yeah, nothing's stopping them from doing that. I'm not saying it's physically impossible. The point is just, would that be a good idea? Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. And so, yeah, there is a sense. I mean, I have quibbles about some of their terms. They make it sound like Congress, that the federal government goes and spends money and just gives orders to the Fed to credit everyone's bank account.
Sure.
And I don't think that's correct. So I do think that sometimes they hand wave over some of the actual legal procedures or protocols. But nonetheless, yeah, there is a sense right now where the government can spend whatever it wants, and it's really just the Fed's discretion as to, we have this dual mandate. And even there, it's not like Fed officials get fired or go to jail if inflation gets too high. Mm-hmm. It's just, they might look bad or something. So yeah, there is a sense in which you could say they have the power to do it right now. And what do we mean when we say do MMT? Because that's the thing too. The MMT proponents, they're not saying we wish the world were like this. They're saying the world is like this right now. And so it just they roll their eyes at all this hand wringing over how we're going to pay for this. So to them, MMT exists right now, and it just means, so let's go ahead and take advantage of it and spend a lot more money than we have been.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. The way you can see this too is like in the Green New Deal, mm-hmm. for example, which I know you guys probably associated with Heartland and know a lot about.
Oh yeah,
they actually the single group right now or coalition that's for a carbon tax. It's not liberal Democrats, it's sort of center left Republicans or
right.
They're the ones pushing a carbon tax because they still think they got to pay for stuff. Whereas the Green New Deal, it's like, oh yeah, let's just spend all this money and we'll pay. I got MMT. In other words, they know the public doesn't like to hear about a carbon tax because that makes gasoline expensive. So I think you're right. The far left Democrats, they love this MMT stuff because that makes it look like we can give everyone these goodies they want and they don't have to pay for it either with taxes.
Yeah, that was seemingly like the big aha moment for me when I was looking at these things as separate. I was looking at the Green New Deal and the projection, $90 trillion over 10 years. And then on the other hand, I'm looking at modern monetary theory and this idea. And then it was when my brain made the connection between those two. It was just like, oh, it all makes sense now. Like this is why their eyes don't cross when they're talking about these plans that cost $90+ trillion over 10 years. It's because they're trying to follow this idea of modern monetary theory. And that's why I, like you say, I think it's dangerous too, because the public, I mean, they kind of know, like when Elizabeth Warren has like $52 trillion or something for Medicare for all over 10 years. Normal people, like they just know, whoa, that can't be a good idea. Mm-hmm. But yet, if you've been, getting hammered for the last year about MMT and how, no, things are different now. Governments aren't like any other entity. They can spend money and nothing bad happens, or at least we can just wait and see. Like, let's spend $1 trillion and see what happens. That kind of idea. Mm-hmm. Then, yeah, that I think really just conditions the public. They're knocking down their normal hesitancy when it comes to these incredibly expensive programs. Right. And one thing else I kind of noticed when I was, like reading your stuff or listening to your podcast episodes is just like there's so many different factors that are in play here, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the U.S. Treasury or just like different banking institutions. So kind of despite what like modern monetary theorists might suggest, there's so much going on here that I don't think anyone could realistically guess what would happen if we really just kind of haphazardly leap into this idea of this monetary system. So to me, it seems like it's just this grand experiment. So I guess my next question would be like what happens if we pursued modern monetary theory and the worst case scenario happens? Can you paint a picture like that?
Well, sure. So I think, and maybe this is what you were getting at before when you said, haven't they already done it? I mean, what they were doing in the immediate years right after the financial crisis hit, I mean, the federal government, I think it was 4 years in a row, had a budget deficit that was $1 trillion plus. Mm-hmm. Again, that's just the deficit, like how much they were spending above and beyond revenues. And then the Fed, of course, was creating trillions of dollars in the so-called quantitative easing programs. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's basically MMT in a nutshell, even though the officials involved were very, careful to reassure the public and especially investors, we're not just monetizing the debt. It's just a coincidence that the Fed is buying up all these treasuries at the same time that, that Uncle Sam is issuing so many more treasuries. And so, if they just kept doing that, I think the ultimate problem is eventually investors will stop giving the U.S. the benefit of the doubt. Mm-hmm. And the problem with something like this is it'll work until it doesn't, and then I think the unraveling would be really fast, mm-hmm. right? So another way of putting it is, I think treasuries are in a giant bubble right now, like as an asset class, and that if they really pursued the recommendations of the MMTers, it would just blow up the bubble even more, and it might look good for a while, and they would be laughing at the naysayers. Oh, I thought you said we couldn't get away with this, but then if for some reason investors around the world lost confidence in the dollar and started, getting rid of their dollar holdings because we've enjoyed this position of, the reserve currency of the world, I think the chickens would come home to roost a lot harder for us than it would be for some other country, right? Because in other words, with us, there's a lot of dollar-denominated assets around the world because the dollar has been considered so safe. And so if the whole world flips on us, mm-hmm. it'll be a bigger deal than just any other random country, if the local population lost faith in their currency.
And by bigger deal, you're talking about massive waves of inflation, right?
Sure, that as everyone's dumping their dollars, the dollar would crash against, foreign currencies. And so all of a sudden, things that were really, you go to Walmart and you're surprised by how cheap stuff is, and a lot of it's coming from China. Well, all of a sudden, what if it's 5 times more expensive?
Right.
Things like that, or oil all of a sudden, going to $300 a barrel, not because for everyone else on Earth oil is that expensive, but just because the dollar loses its strength against the other currencies, right. That kind of thing.
And all of those dollars rush into this country because that's the only place that they would have value anymore. If you're talking about this global upheaval. And yeah, that's the worst case scenario there.
So if I could just, because partly what's been going on is, here very loosely speaking, before when the U.S. when people still trust the dollar, ultimately the Fed can create $1 billion in extra money, and then to the extent that foreigners are willing to hold $100 bills, and they do. Mm-hmm. Then the U.S. Americans are getting all those, because how do they get the $100 bills? They got to give us something for it. We don't just give people $100 bills for nothing. And so in terms of the macro aggregates, it's foreigners are shipping goods to Americans in exchange for $100 bills, and then those foreigners are just sitting on them.
Right.
Like they're adding them to their currency, holdings, and the same thing with treasuries and whatever. So the point is, that's the way in which we could print money, and our prices domestically haven't been rising as much as you otherwise would have expected. Right. Given how many dollars they're creating. Mm-hmm. So then the problem is, though, if that unravels, then all of a sudden it's not just the dollars that we print during the year 2023 that are going to, sort of be pushing up prices. It's all the dollars that have been accumulating in foreigners' cash balances over the last several decades that might come flooding back. So that's the issue.
I do want to quickly jump on Japan a little bit, too, because people like Stephanie Kelton and other modern monetary theorists suggest that Japan is an example of a successful usage of modern monetary theory. So she says, I think in that same interview with CNBC, she mentions how the debt to GDP ratio in Japan is something like 240%, and that they have no signs of out-of-control inflation. So frame of reference for those listening, that would be like the equivalent of America having like a national debt of like $50 trillion. So, I mean, is it true that Japan is living high and mighty because of modern monetary theory?
Okay, so what is true is, and for full disclosure, I lost a wager to Brian Kaplan and David Henderson, two other free market economists. I thought quantitative easing in the U.S. was going to lead to higher CPI than it did, and so we had public wagers, and I lost. So it's for people like me who were concerned about the rounds of quantitative easing, and we're telling people, watch out, this is going to push up prices. It is true that Japan shows it's not necessarily the case, right? It is possible for a government to run up the debt to a huge amount, compared to the size of its economy, and for its monetary authorities to print a bunch of money without causing runaway price inflation. But having said all that, it's certainly not successful. I mean, the reason Japan has run up such a huge debt and they've printed so much money is because they've been stuck in a rut for decades now.
Right.
And so it always strikes me as funny. In other words, what the MMT people are actually saying is, what are you talking about? We could have our policies in place and have a crappy economy for 3 decades. Look, just like Japan did.
Right.
Why can't we do that? We can wreck our economy for 3 decades too. Why not? So so there is that element. So it's certainly not a success story. Really, all they're showing is it's possible that the worst effects of what the critics are warning about might not hit anytime soon.
Right.
So that's really the issue. But yeah, it's not like it worked in Japan. That's the reason that they're still doing it, is because they're stuck in a rut.
Yeah. So kind of going back to that first idea that the government could spend all of this money, and then if there's inflation, they can soak it up with taxes. And if you just let that play out over a course of time, you can kind of see a draining of the private sector and an expansion of the public sector in terms of government spending. And yeah, when you actually look under the hood of Japan, I mean, you mentioned the big point that their GDP has been pretty much stagnant since like the mid-90s. If you look at a GDP chart, in fact, if you just Google it, like you see it generally increase, hits about the mid-90s, and it's just plateaued ever since. And then if you dig a little bit deeper, you could see that idea of transitioning the private into the public sphere is happening. The amount of government spending has composed a larger and larger portion of their GDP over the same period of time that they've plateaued, and their Japan's household spending has steadily decreased over the last 20 years. So can they really call this a success story? Like it just seems like what you were saying. Like we could have a terrible economy for 30 years as well.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing too for people to check is to their stock market. When you do inflation adjusted, their stock market, that's really bad as well. And it's true. So again, the problem here is it's going to be hard for them to dig out of these commitments. Again, Medicare for all, things like that, or especially like a UBI, things like that, Green New Deal. These things are going to be really hard to unwind, and it's. And I think, too, so I confess, if you had told me in 1985 what the Japanese government and Bank of Japan were going to do over the next 25 years, I would have been surprised that they kept, that people still had faith in them and were still lending them money and interest rates were so low. So I will admit to that. But on the other hand, I think partly how they get away with it is because everybody is still sure that, oh, yeah, they're good for it. They're very conservative, high savings rate, very serious people. And so it's just like, somebody who's a wealthy person, very productive and has an impeccable record, has a great credit score. If he wanted to, he could let his debt to income ratio get really high.
Sure.
Whereas somebody who's, making $30,000 a year and, is behind in his credit card payments and things like that and has a bad history, he wouldn't have been able to get such loans advanced to him, even just as a share of his income, without paying ridiculous APRs. So it is true that a real responsible, wealthy person can run up a huge debt. But again, that doesn't mean it's a responsible thing to do. It's just showing, you could get away with it under certain circumstances, and disaster wouldn't hit you right away. But the other thing too is it's not like right wingers who worry about this stuff are just making up phantom menaces.
Sure.
I mean, we have Zimbabwe, we have Venezuela. Right? There are cases, and it's not just basket case countries. I mean, interwar Germany, right? Yeah. So. It's not like we're wrong for thinking printing more money leads to price inflation. That's the standard thing. And just in some of these cases, there could be extenuating circumstances to show how they could get away with printing so much money without it crashing their currency.
So my last question for you is, like I said, modern monetary theory seems like the path of least resistance for politicians that want to spend. Is there anything that we can do, even from a policy perspective or just like a societal perspective, to kind of fight back against the implementation of this type of monetary system? I mean, is pushing for like a balanced budget amendment, a return to the gold standard? What do you think? Secession.
Yeah, I mean, I know the things in the U.S., I'm really amazed at how badly things have gone. And so, it wouldn't surprise me if there's rising calls for secession, like Texas, for example. I don't know if it'll go anywhere, but that wouldn't surprise me in terms of, I could see a lot of people thinking there's no way we can reform Washington. We just need to break away from this system. The thing, I mean, balanced budget amendment, but even there, it really, all they have to do is to Congress has to stop increasing the debt ceiling.
Sure.
And then you would automatically have a balanced budget going forward. So anytime a Republican in particular votes to increase the debt ceiling and then rails about how we need a balanced budget amendment. I don't believe that person. It's like all you have to do is stop increasing the debt ceiling and boom, you got it.
Right.
And so there's that element. I mean, to me, what I'm trying to do is just to educate the public and to get them to see creating more money doesn't make us richer, right? You know, I mean, simple thought is, if you double the amount of dollars, once the dust settles, you know, there's not more cars, there's not more food, it's not like more people know how to program computers because there's more dollar bills. So it can't be that we're richer in real terms. All it can be is that some people are richer and some are poor, and probably on net we're poor collectively because of the confusion and the mistakes that inflation would have led people to do. But yeah, to me, I think just educating the public on this stuff, because the reason they're going to get away with it if they go through with this is enough people are going to just be lulled into temporary, you know, disbelief and think, oh yeah, you can just create $50 trillion and probably nothing bad will happen. Why not?
Right.
I mean, it's in other words, it's an indictment of the standard economics profession. I think that enough people can be led to believe that the politicians promising like that can get away with it.
All right, that's a good place to end it for me, I think. For those that are listening that are particularly interested in what you have to say, where can they go to kind of stay up to date with your work?
I would probably just point them to my website, which is consultingbyrpm.com. So consultingbyrpm.com.
All right, fantastic, sir. Bob Murphy, thank you again for being on with us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, excellent. Well, gents, I think we put together a pretty nice episode here. Like I said, next week you can tune in, get my thoughts on Star Wars. But any other words of wisdom, jokes, anecdotes, anything you want to get off your chest before we sign off for the week? Jim?
I would just say that you can go to a website that we have all of the coverage of our events in Madrid at climaterealityforum.com. You can see all the videos there and more information, and I hope you like it.
Justin, anything you want to say before we sign off for the week?
I've got nothing.
Fantastic.
Nothing.
Well,
Absolutely nothing.
All right, folks. Thank you for tuning in for this episode of In the Tank Podcast. If you like our show, please subscribe. Write a review for us on iTunes. We'd greatly appreciate it. You could also find us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, even pretty much everything nowadays. If you would like, you can follow us on Twitter at In the Tank Pod. And if you would like to send us some comments, suggestions, questions, anecdotes, jokes, whatever you'd like, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Jim, where can the fine people find you?
At J Lakely on Twitter. You can find Heartland at Heartland Inst. And go Boris Johnson, Freedom Rising.
Oh, God. And Justin, same question. Where can the fine people find you?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and Twitter.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll talk to you next week.